Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom track at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z Martin, and today our guest is Lynn Zubernis. And Lynn is the author of many books on Supernatural, but today we're going to be talking about Supernatural Fangirls and Fandom at the Crossroads. Lynn, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be back to chat with you again here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. And Lynn, to start off, you've got a very interesting background which drives both of these books. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to decide to write these two books?
It is a little bit of a strange kind of journey. So I am a psychologist by profession. And at the time, way back when I started the research for these two books, I was working full-time actually as a clinician. I was the assistant director of a university counseling center. So I was a clinician working full-time as a psychologist. And then I fell in love with Supernatural and was sort of blown away by how absolutely head over heels I fell in love with Supernatural. So kind of my psychologist brain sort of kicked in, and I literally wanted to figure out what was going on with me. And really the bottom line was I wanted to figure out, is this okay? Have I lost my mind? Is this good? Is this bad? And the only thing I knew to do as a psychologist was to go to the research and try to figure it out. So that's what I did. And that was the way that the research started for these two books. They started out, my co-author, Kathy Larson, who's a professor, not a psychologist, she's an English professor, but we had both fallen in love with Supernatural together, and we were both kind of wondering whether we were still okay and whether this was okay. So we started out our research project together, and our original goal was to write a book that was kind of a hybrid book, sort of half academic book and half very accessible to fans, because we wanted it to kind of, kind of take issue with what we had found in some of the research, because a lot of it, the early research in the early 2000s on fandom was kind of pathologizing, we felt. And that didn't line up with our experience in fandom at all. So we wanted to write books to say, hey, that's not the whole story. We think fandom can be good and healthy and help with identity development and figuring out who you are and self-concept and all those things. So it really started out as a big research project.
And I love that, well, in Supernatural Fangirls, just your whole narrative about attending the conventions and your experience as a fan at the conventions and all of those pieces just rang so true with me, having spent a couple of decades of my life at conventions. I could just really, I could really identify, I could see it, I've been there, I've done that. But I love how you can also pull back from that and kind of put your psychologist lens on or hat on and say, now what's really going on here? Let's kind of look at this from, a different lens perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was not the easiest thing to do, being both at the same time.
No, it wasn't easy at all. But so what happened was, as we started out on this research project, is we collected all this research and we also had all these experiences ourselves as fans. So we kind of had two big sort of, virtual filing cabinets of information, and then we didn't quite know how to put them together, and we thought we could make a completely hybrid book. And then we got an agent and tried to get a publisher, and the agent loved the idea and was totally down with it, but every publisher that she went to, they would sort of scratch their heads and say, well, wait, is this an academic book or is it a book for fans? And she would say, it's both. And they would say, you can't do that. So we had a terrible time finding anyone to publish the book. We finally decided to just go with an academic publisher, and that book turned into Fandom at the Crossroads, which is an academic book, but we were sort of so disappointed that it had to be just an academic book that we snuck in a whole bunch of fandom anecdotes anyway as a way of illustrating the academic things that we had found. But that one, you know, a little tiny publisher in the UK took a chance on us, and I don't even know if anybody would have ever read that book except Henry Jenkins, who's sort of the father of the whole field of fan studies, discovered the book and liked it and interviewed us for his blog and was a proponent of the book. So that way it sort of took off. But we still felt like we hadn't really told the rest of the story. And at the time, I remember I'm friends with the film writer and director M. Night Shyamalan, and I was sort of telling him about the dilemma and, you know, what are we going to do with this book? And he said, you're going about it the wrong way. You need to tell your own story. That's the compelling story. You can, you know, buttress it with the research that you found, but you've got a story that's a compelling story that everybody else who is a fan, and he identifies as a fan, he's a huge sports fan. So he said, that's the story I want to hear. Write that story, put yourself back in the story. Now, as an academic, you do not do that. You do not put yourself in the story. So Kathy and I were just sort of like, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I, you know, it eventually became a memoir because it is our sort of wild and crazy road trip through fandom. It reads like a novel, like it's not true, because so many incredibly weird and crazy and unexpected things happen to us, but it actually is all true. It's actually a memoir. So that's the weird origin of Fangasm, Supernatural Fangirls.
I think one of my favorites in there, and you recap it also in Fandom at the Crossroads, was that first interview you did with Danielle Harris, who later becomes Danielle Ackles, and the whole trying to coordinate it with Jensen and getting frog marched out by the men with no necks.
Oh my God. That was, at the time, that was like a traumatic experience because she had said through someone else that we had met that she wanted to do the interview. But then when we got there, this was a long time ago, our cell phones did not work in the convention center. So we had no way to contact her. And I made the mistake of, in a photo op, saying to Jensen, we're trying to get in touch with Danielle, like we're supposed to do an interview. I was literally trying to conduct business in a photo op because I didn't know any better. Of course, you can't do that. So instantly some big giant guy with no neck swooped down on me and just bodily like marched me out of the room. I thought they were throwing me out of the convention. I was like, oh my God, that's it. It's one of my first conventions. I'm never coming back. They're never going to let me in again. I was horrified. But then Jensen, to his credit, very, very responsible person that he is, did go tell Danielle, and she came and found us. So that really says something about the two of them.
And then the same guy that frog marched you out escorted you back to the secret backstage rooms where you did the interview.
It was completely unreal. When Danielle came to get us, we were still sort of like, oh my God, we might be getting kicked out. What's happening? What's going on? And she was like, come on. And we were like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if we should be going with you. What's happening? And then when she started taking us backstage with this big, intimidating man, I really was still, I probably was white as a ghost because I was still convinced, oh no, it's that guy again. Now he's going to see me trying to get into the green room. I'm really going to be in trouble. But of course, then he was just there to say, come in, ladies, have a seat, have some food.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to kick Danielle out. So you were probably safe.
No, they did not. They did not. Yeah, but that's why Fangasm Supernatural Fangirls doesn't read like a memoir. It reads like fiction because truly ridiculous things happened to us along that entire journey. And a lot of it was because we were completely awkward at trying to decide who we were at any given time. Could we be fangirls Could we also be researchers? We weren't comfortable with that. And I think our awkwardness just landed us in some crazy situations.
Well, it did, but it also made for some very genuine situations. And I think the fact that you didn't have the slickness of a traditional journalist or media person lent a lot of ability for readers to identify with what you went through, because it's much closer to the norm for regular people than it is for somebody who's got a press pass, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah. We were not. We were the antithesis of smooth. Let me tell you. I think we managed to mostly hang on to like a semblance of professional because, you know, I was a psychologist. She was an English professor. We were used to being kind of professional, professorly, whatever. So we managed to hang on to that. But as far as journalistic smoothness, oh no, no.
Well, and I love how in both books you touch on something that I think doesn't get talked about enough, and that is women and fandom and the cultural constraints around what women are supposed to like and participate in, especially as it applies to their age, their expression of sexuality, or just their exuberance. You know, the thing that struck me reading both of your books as well as Conventional Wisdom was that our culture, maybe Western culture, has these safe places where you're allowed to be a really exuberant fan. And those are usually sports arenas, rock concerts, and religious festivals or holidays, or if you've ever been to a tent revival, that kind of is the same experience of you're allowed to feel all the feelings big. But otherwise, and those are all male driven and male dominated and very patriarchal spaces. Mm-hmm. Women are allowed to have those, you know, be exuberant if they're properly chaperoned.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I loved your insight on fandom as a place where women are exploring that exuberance without those constraints, and outer society doesn't really know what to do with that.
No, and what we found is that our society and many societies are really intimidated by that. You know, that there's something frightening about women who are unabashedly passionate about something, whether it's in a sexual way or just in a I am joyous about this way. All of that passion somehow seems kind of unbridled, and what's going on over there? We can't contain this, and it's scary. If we can't contain a bunch of women, oh my God, what might possibly happen? Yeah, that's something that we didn't really realize until we started doing the research and we started talking to people. And especially at that time, you know, when we started researching, it would have been 2007. So that's 13 years ago now. And there was a difference in fandom even between then and now, in that within fandom communities, which the communities that we landed in for Supernatural were largely communities of women, the online communities. And the norms in those communities were be yourself, be real, be passionate, be sexual, be angry, be sad, be joyous, be whatever you are in a very real way. And for both Kathy and I, we were like, what is this? Like, nobody has ever invited me to be totally real in this way and then validated me when I was totally real. So we really found that life-changing. But it is something that, especially in the early days of fandom, there was a lot of probably some internalized shame and a lot of protectiveness around the fan communities, because we wanted to keep that the way it was. And we didn't want anybody from the outside sort of coming in and shutting that down. So there wasn't nearly as much reciprocity and as much interaction. And it was interesting because Supernatural was one of the fandoms that first started to change that and started to open up the lines of communication between fans and cast in kind of a tentative way.
Well, and I love what you talk about in both books about powers that be, and how in many cases they don't really understand the fandom even as much as the cast understands it and some of the writers understand it. And that certainly rang true to me from a publishing standpoint, because big publishers, as a general rule, don't come to conventions. So I'd go back to my editor or my publisher and say, seriously, I think this is really going to fly because all these things happened at these conventions. And they go, no, well, they've never moved out of their desk in New York City, but they, they knew fans and they didn't. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting insight for us too. And it took us a while. We started out thinking that the quote unquote, the powers that be included the actors. And I think our biggest understanding as we got into the research and experienced more and more of it was, oh, it's not the actors who have the power. They're also on the strings. They're not the ones who are calling the shots. They are the ones who are interacting, especially for Supernatural, in a more genuine, organic way with the fandom. So they're starting to understand the fandom, whereas the powers that be in whatever, whether they're in publishing or film or television or whatever, are at their desks. And even if they maybe take a field trip to a convention, they're not there in the same way to experience it as an insider. So they often don't understand. And it took us a while to realize, oh, the actors, they're not the powers that be. We had this all wrong. That's not what's happening.
And that comes back in many ways to who controls the lens, the kind of male-dominated powers that be versus the largely female fandom in Supernatural's case. And that whole concept of fan shame and guilt, which I think is definitely something that needs to be talked about more. But please talk about that now, because I thought that was really one of the biggest takeaways from both books.
Yeah. And I don't know that we were really expecting to find it. And, Fangasm especially is, because it's a memoir, it's a really personal journey that Kathy and I took that we then laid bare on the pages of a book for some ridiculous reason, because M. Night Shyamalan told us to. I don't know. I still don't know why we really did that. I'm glad we did, but it was very scary. But it was part of our own sort of process of discovery too, that we had to come to terms with the fact that we were also ashamed. Nobody really wants to think that about themselves. And I think, at the age we were grown women, we had families and kids and jobs and careers, and we kind of thought we'd arrived and, we had thrown off things like internalized shame, but no, there it was. And so it was a process of having to discover that and sort of see that in ourselves before we could then start to push back against it. I think the really hopeful and positive thing that I've seen from studying fandom over 15 years now is that shame about being a fan is getting less. It's getting less across the board for both males and females, I think, but we studied it mostly for females because it's always been a little bit different for women. Younger people who are coming into fandom now are like, what do you mean? You're like, what would you be ashamed of? There's nothing here to be ashamed of. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's the house phone ringing.
Okay.
Please ignore the strange ringing in the background if you're watching this. But I think that's really hopeful that it has started to get less. And I think younger fans, especially who didn't come into fandom at a time when they felt that, like, don't ask, don't tell, don't talk about fandom, don't let anybody ask about fandom. They don't understand that. And I think that's a really good thing. I think that's a hopeful thing about fandom and something that I've seen evolve over the years.
I think it definitely has changed. And I know I have seen not only younger fans, but also just as we've sort of won the geek culture war in terms of all the blockbuster movies being from comics, and sci-fi and fantasy, it's harder and harder for somebody to say, oh, you like that stuff? What? You mean that $10 billion movie that was a global bestseller? That's the one you're trash talking? Do tell.
Yeah.
You know, there has been a lot more ways to push back on any of that. But you're right. Nobody has ever really fan shamed guys in approved fandoms like sports teams.
Yeah.
You want
No.
to drop thousands of dollars for a 50-yard line season pass.
Yeah.
And drive hundreds of miles to have your gridiron lunch with the coach.
Yeah, and you can paint yourself half green and half white and wear a weird thing on your head, and you know, there's all kinds of things that's one of the first things that really struck us. Like, wait a minute, why can you do those things? Those things are the same things and they come out of the same impulses. Why are those socially acceptable, but me screaming at a supernatural convention or Comic-Con is not acceptable? Like, where's the difference here?
Well, and the same thing is true at a rock concert. If you go to see one of the classic rock bands and buy the albums and get them autographed and buy the t-shirts, and there's an unbridled, not only exuberance, but a sexuality that goes with those concerts that is perfectly okay in that setting.
I think it's less okay than that. Even that is less okay than the guys going to the sports events. You know, certainly there was tons of shame around like Beatlemania. I mean, that is before my time, but back in the day, and there's still, you know, women who like BTS or women who like the Backstreet Boys back in the day or whatever. There's still shame around that, I think, for things that are perceived as female-centric music fandoms. But less than if you're a Supernatural fan, I guess.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really powerful thing to point out, because you have to see something in order to decide to change it. If you aren't aware that it's there, then you can't consciously root it out in yourself and around you.
Yeah, yeah. And that was part of the journey of being Kathy, and we fought it for a while. Like, we didn't want to think that we had this shame, and we eventually had to realize that we did. And then we had some interesting interpersonal dynamics, because we sort of, our trajectories in terms of fandom and identity as a fan kind of diverged a little. So there's a lot of drama in Fangasm Supernatural Fangirls, and that's all true too.
Well, and I think in terms of people owning their fandom roots, when I got started as a published author, which was close to 15 years ago, it wasn't something that you said out loud at a convention that, hi, I'm up here with this New York published book. But back in high school and college, I wrote a lot of fan fiction, and that's really where I learned to write and learned to entertain people, and that's where I got my start. It wasn't until years later that it felt safe to come out and say that. And I know one time I was on a panel about Star Wars, and I fessed up that the first book-length project I ever completed was a Star Wars fan fiction novel. And then I realized I was sitting on the panel in between Timothy Zahn and Michael Stackpole. Times best-selling Star Wars tie-in fiction authors.
Oh, well.
Fortunately, I've been buddies with both of them for years, and Tim just looked at me and said, yeah, we all are. Don't let it bother you.
I mean, there's no difference between tie-in fiction and fan fiction except the way it's published.
And that they get paid for it, yeah. Exactly,
yeah.
Well, and it is more managed by the powers that be, who have the ultimate say on the stories.
Yeah, that's the trade-off.
But yeah, I loved that part in both books. It was painful because I could see it being true about the shame and the guilt, but I agree, we're making progress. Which is one.
No, I mean, we've now heard so many, best-selling authors say, oh yeah, I got my start writing fan fiction. It's become almost like a truism. I still think people who are not sort of savvy about fandom at all retain this. You still see mainstream articles sometimes that refer to something that's poorly written as fan fiction, as though that's an equivalent statement, whereas really some of the best writing I've seen in my entire life has been fan fiction. So I think there's still a little stigma around it, but it's way better than it was.
Well, to be honest, literary fiction views all genre fiction with ends of suspicion. Even the people who are, best-selling authors in genre fiction, oh, well, you didn't write something terribly depressing about real people without any magic. It's not legitimate.
Yeah, so that's true. I mean, the whole high culture, low culture idea will never go away completely.
No, we're pretty used to that, but I go back to the fact we won the movie wars.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, agreed.
And I think something that really ties into that whole, how do the powers that be see fans? How do fans see themselves? That whole shame and guilt piece comes into how fans are portrayed. And there's really been an arc of that, even in Supernatural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was an interesting arc too, because it didn't necessarily kind of start down low and then go high. It's sort of been like that, because I actually loved Eric Kripke's depiction of fans. I know not everybody loved Becky Rosen as the fangirl, and I don't think it was perfection by any means, but it was so clear that it came out of a place of affection and understanding for Eric Kripke, that I loved it. And maybe it was easier for me to see it that way because at the time he contributed to these two books that we're talking about tonight. So I had a lot of conversation with him about fans and about the show. So I really knew what kind of a fanboy he was and how he really wasn't stigmatizing it. So I think for me, it hit up here and I really liked it. But then once Kripke wasn't writing the character anymore, when she came back, I hated the way they brought her back and what they turned her into. All the affection for that character, the character of the fangirl, was gone, just obliterated. I was crushed by that season 7 episode. But then along came Robbie Thompson and wrote Fangirls in a different way. So now I feel better again.
Yeah, I mean, when we first met Becky in the Monster at the End of This Book, in the Carver Edlund episode, and then in The Real Ghostbusters, where Sam and Dean get tricked into coming to a Supernatural convention, she's, a little crazy for them, and she's got a tremendous crush on Sam, but it really isn't a negative portrayal. She's just, really into this.
And she saves the day and she walks away in a relationship with the creator, AKA Kripke. Like, you can't be more affectionate than that.
No. And then you're right, when we come back to season 7, Time for a Wedding, and she roofies Sam and, forces him into this sham marriage, and, poor Sam, there he is again, yeah, it was really loathsome. But then
I hated it. And I hated in the end what they had to say about her, the disparaging, it was like, you have no redeeming quality. Oh my God, that episode doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned.
It was very much like Stephen King's book Misery, where you've got the super obsessed fan who's going to basically kill the writer.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought it was really, it's never a good look to make fun of the people who are paying for what you create.
Especially without any, if you want to do, we're making fun of you, we're making fun of, something like a lot of their meta episodes sort of make fun of everything. They make fun of themselves, they make fun of the fans. That's great. That season 7 episode was just pointed. We see you, we think you're weird, we don't like what you do. You're going to be ruined in the end.
But then we have seen Becky get a redemption arc.
Yes, finally. Yay.
So she stands up to Chuck, and she's got a husband and kids and a career, and she's writing for herself. And she tells him off even after she finds out he's God.
Yeah, no, I love that they did bring her back, because leaving her where she was with season 7, Time for a Wedding, would have been terrible. And I love Emily Perkins. Emily Perkins is absolutely awesome. We've had some great in-depth conversations about this kind of stuff. Her partner is a fan studies scholar, a media studies scholar. Like, she is awesome. So I was so happy for her too, that she got to come back.
Well, and then we also saw a fanboy, especially in mint condition. And I loved how they handled, we just watched that last night in the Supernatural group. But I loved how they handled both the girl who ran the comic book shop and the guy who ended up being the unlikely hero, because even though the other guy wasn't, you know, maybe the best person, hey, he's my friend and you're going to have to come through me to get to him.
Yeah.
And Dean, fanboys, and actually Dean is the biggest fanboy between the two of them, I swear.
And he always has been, but they made it overt in that episode. I love that episode. I think that was my favorite episode of the whole season, or maybe the second favorite episode of that season, because yeah, again, that was sort of an affectionate poking fun. And it was also kind of, I mean, a lot of the people who write for the show identify as fans themselves, fanboys themselves. And I think that came through in that episode.
It did. And, you know, we've seen Dean be a fanboy so many times when he references Finding Nemo. I'm not going to apologize for loving that fish. And he quotes Lord of the Rings. And, you know, Sam usually calls him on it, but even there, it's like, hey, wait, I thought you always said I was the nerd, but you're apparently remembering all the lines.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Dean is, you know, Dean is such a complex character, but Dean is embodying some of that shame and stigma that we talked about that's not completely gone. He absolutely is a fanboy, but, you know, in his definition of masculine cool, it may not include that. So he's still got kind of an internal struggle going on.
Well, I think when we're talking about the powers that be either laughing with us or laughing at us, I always think of the movie Galaxy Quest, which I don't know if you've seen it, but
a long time ago I have, yeah.
Yeah, versus The Big Bang. Galaxy Quest is, to me, a very loving letter to the fandom. If you have ever been to a Dragon Con or a Comic Con, you're sitting there going, I know those people. I am those people.
Yeah.
Wait, that, you know, and it never felt like it was punching down.
Yeah, agreed.
Big Bang was smart and clever, but I always felt it was the cool kids still punching down at the nerds. They just made the nerds punch each other.
I didn't really watch that.
That's why I never got into the show, because it always had that edge to me. And others, you know, may not have taken that away from it. But what I watched of it, I always felt, oh, they're not really laughing with us like they were in Galaxy Quest.
Yeah, and you know, it's hard to even spell out what that difference is, but you know it when you feel it.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely know when you feel it. And that kind of comes back to what you had talked about earlier, where some of the original early fan studies looked at fandom from a way that kind of pathologized it.
Oh, yeah.
And instead of looking at it as something that could possibly be genuine and even therapeutic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, one of the first things we ran into was the original research on parasocial relationships, which, you know, an entirely one-way relationship where one person feels like the other person knows who they are and feels something for them, but the other person doesn't know they exist. It was a very sort of negative, pathologizing way to look at fandom. It completely ignored one of the biggest benefits of fandom, which is the whole idea of community. So it painted fans as kind of sort of semi-delusional people, you know, sitting in their basements, looking at pictures and just making up fantasies about someone, which looking at pictures and making up fantasies about someone, nothing wrong with that. But when I read that research, I was like, I haven't met anyone who is delusional enough to think that Jensen Ackles is about to call them up and ask them to marry him. Like, that's not what this is about. Nobody's out there doing that. And where's your research about what it does for people to be part of a community where they can be themselves and that encourages their creativity and their identity exploration? Where's that? And that was nowhere at the time.
Well, I think the other thing that it also completely overlooks is that outside of those huge conventions like New York and San Diego Comic-Con, where there's a very definite line between the attendees and the guests, when you get to the regional genre conventions, and these were going long before Supernatural conventions started, they are smaller, they are by design much more intimate, and people who have been attending those as fans and as professionals over the years do get to know each other.
Yeah.
Friendships do start up. People who, people actually get to know their favorite authors because they're small and intimate gatherings, and the big lines and the men with no necks aren't there.
And even, I mean, even with Supernatural, certainly if you go to a Supernatural convention, there is definitely a line, there is definitely a hierarchy, there are definitely security people and rules and regulations, etc. But that said, Supernatural especially has held conventions so often, those actors absolutely know the fans who they see again and again and again. They know them by name. They know their family circumstances. They remember them. They ask what they relate human to human. So even by that sort of that strict definition of the parasocial relationship, even that doesn't hold up. It doesn't mean that they're our best friends. You know, I haven't met many people delusional enough to think that either. But is there a recognition and a mutual respect and a human to human appreciation? Yeah, there is.
Yeah, and again, I think that comes from people who either observed as outsiders or did not observe the totality of fandom, or did not observe from inside to understand what they were really talking about.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why in both Fandom at the Crossroads and especially in Fangasm, Supernatural Fangirls, throughout both those books, there are hundreds of pages of interviews, because a lot of our research was talking to fans and then talking to actors. And we wanted to talk to actors, not just fans, because we did want to know what's it like on the other side. Like, what fans are worried that people on the other side are like wanting to run away from them and thinking they're weirdos. What are those people really thinking? So that's why every time we did an interview with Jared or Jensen or Misha or Chad or whoever it was, one of the things we asked was, so do you identify as a fan? And if so, talk about that. And B, what do you think of this phenomenon of you being a celebrity and having fans? How do you see fans? Because that's a great way to get rid of stigma, is hearing in somebody's own words about how they feel. So we were trying to attack that fan shame by kind of bringing it out in the open and saying, you know, these people who you're fanning don't think you should be ashamed. Like, they don't think there's anything weird about this. So maybe we shouldn't be so ashamed either.
I thought it was really funny. I was watching Peter Capaldi, who is not the most recent Doctor Who, but the previous one. He was on a talk show, and the host pulled out this book about Doctor Who fandom. Of course, that show has been going on for over 50 years. And there was a letter that was written back in the late 70s in the Doctor Who fan club, official fan club. And it said something about, we really have to do something about Peter C. He's just so annoying. Oh. And it was because he had been such an exuberant fanboy at the time. And of course, he grew up to be then one of the official doctors. But
oh my God, that's so funny.
And watching Capaldi on the guest couch, he's a very tall, thin man. He literally put his hands over his face, brought his knees up to his chest on this couch going, oh, no, you're not going to read that letter.
Oh my God, that's so awesome. I love that. I love that.
Yeah. And look, he grew up to be, the doctor. So there.
I mean, many of the people who are making the media, Steven Spielberg and M. Night Shyamalan and George Lucas and like Eric Kripke, like these people are fans. They started out as fans. So yeah, they get it. So I love Jared Padalecki's chapter in Family Don't End with Blood. I know we're not talking about that book, but one of the things that makes his chapter in that book so powerful is he takes you through his own history as a fanboy. So by the time you get to the end of his chapter, there's no doubt in your mind, oh, he gets it. He has been right there where I am. If I'm feeling nervous about being in a photo op with Jared Padalecki has been right there with other people that he fans.
Yeah, and that is a wonderful commonality because there's just a joy in being a fan.
Yeah.
That I feel very sorry for people who haven't experienced it.
Oh, yeah, man, me too. I mean, talk about life-changing in so many ways. I will be forever grateful to Supernatural for making me fall so hard that I changed the entire trajectory of my life. I started out saying where I was working, so I left my position at the counseling center and got a job as a professor because I wanted to do this research kind of full-time along with teaching. So big change in my life.
Well, and you've heard me talk about how I went down the rabbit hole hard for Supernatural, started reading the fan fiction again, which is something I had gotten away from reading. Not only read the case fan fiction, but also the slash. Decided that I really enjoyed that and ended up launching a whole new pen name with the Morgan Bryce urban fantasy male paranormal romance, which again changed my life and my publishing career.
Yeah.
So yeah, which brings us to two other things, which is slash and the whole idea of hurt comfort, which are big fan fiction pieces and also things that fans often feel they need to hide a little bit about, or they're not comfortable. They've been made to feel not comfortable.
Yeah, still. I think still. Again, I think less, but I think still. That's one of the first things that I discovered when I fell into Supernatural fandom. And honestly, I was sort of like, what is this? Like that, it was just like a whole new thing. But there was a lot of shame around it. I think there definitely is less. But what's happened now is that shame around something like slash, reading or writing slash, has sort of translated into, well, you can write it about this because somebody deems that this is okay to write about, but you can't write it about this because somebody deems that this is not okay. And there's all kinds of ephemeral rules of what is okay and what is not okay, which really kind of smacks of that shame being brought back. And the reason why a lot of my psychological research about fandom and about fan fiction, the reason it was so healthy for people was because there wasn't that kind of censorship and there wasn't that kind of shame that people, it's, as a psychologist, we use narrative therapy all the time. This is how people make sense of their life. This is how people work through their life and the stuff that they've been through, is by writing. So fan fiction was just this unbelievably fertile ground where people could write whatever they were compelled to write, whatever they were inspired to write. And some of it, other people would be like, oh, no, that's not for me. And that was always fine. But there were always other people who were like, oh, yeah, this is for me. This speaks to me. Maybe my life has been like yours. Maybe there's some reason why this speaks to me too. Same with hurt comfort. There were a lot of people writing hurt comfort who frankly had a lot of hurt that they had to work through. And hurt comfort is really just self-narrative therapy. It's working through that hurt and bringing yourself to the comfort place where maybe in real life you never had that comfort. Same with slash. Maybe in real life you never were able to have a relationship that really was a relationship of equals, or maybe it took you a long time to get to one. So writing about it and exploring it and making it problematic so that you can maybe someday get to the unproblematic, that's really therapeutic. So I hate seeing that. I feel like we had a shift of like shame going down, 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 and now we've got shame going back up a little bit, which is kind of disheartening to see.
Well, it's interesting because I've gotten to know a lot of authors in the non-fandom published male-male romance area. And I often refer to Supernatural as the show that launched 1,000 ships, ships in quotation, because I swear 80% of the published male-male romance authors are Supernatural fans and kind of found their way to original fiction through that.
Oh, really? That's so interesting.
Oh, and we drop all these Easter eggs for each other in the books, you know, whether it's somebody driving a Black Impala or just a little phrase here or there. I'll ping somebody and go, "You're a fan, aren't you?" Yeah. So we actually intentionally dropped some of those Easter eggs in there for fans. With The Hurt Comfort, I think it's really interesting. I saw a discussion about whether or not people would start writing the pandemic into their fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it was particularly on the romance side. And some people were like, oh my gosh, you know, I never want to think about this again after we're through with it. This is just traumatic. And other people were saying, you know, this is how some people deal with what's traumatic,
mm-hmm.
by putting a character through it and they triumph, and therefore either reader can triumph. And I've seen that in so much Supernatural fanfic. You know, Dean is a brittle diabetic. Sam loses a leg. You know,
yeah.
All these chronic conditions, and it's somebody working through that, and other people work through it with them. There's a healing process there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to what Freud had to say about mastery and our drive for mastery and control. And when you're faced with circumstances in your life when you have no control, being able to write and control the narrative of what happens is tremendously therapeutic and hopeful. And the same discussion going on in fan fiction circles, by the way, and about whether or not to, it depends on sort of where you are in your processing of the pandemic. Like, I don't think I could write about it right now. It's too open and raw and sort of fresh for me, but probably someday I will want to.
Well, we had Croatoan, so, you know.
Yeah, Supernatural's already written about it, yeah.
Well, and there are a fair number of pandemic fanfics out there.
Oh, yeah.
For COVID.
Apocryphic is a whole genre of fan fiction, so you know that's been around for a long time. I should go back and reread some of those. As a matter of fact, that would probably be therapeutic.
Oh, well, once again, the time has gone by so fast.
Oh gosh!
I know we're going to be talking again because there are more books to discuss. Yay!
Yay!
So thank you again, Lynn, for being with us. Tell us where people can find you online and find these wonderful books.
You can find me online at all social media as Fangasm SPN. I also have a website, fangasmthebook.com, and you can find actually these two books that we're talking about tonight, Fangasm Supernatural Fangirls. Thank you, John Barrowman, for that title. And Fandom at the Crossroads, both on Amazon. And you can find my newer books, Peace When You Are Done. There'll be Peace When You Are Done, let's get it right, and Family Don't End with Blood at the website peacewhenyouaredone.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for being here, and I look forward to talking about more of those books soon.
Me too.
I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and you've been here with us on Continual for the Supernatural Fandom track. Stay tuned. We're going to have a lot more good stuff coming up soon. Thanks for being here, and I hope to see you again soon.
Bye.